With 2026 kickoffs just around the corner, the most recent addition to the agent lineup, Veto, is making much less of a splash than his last year's counterpart in Teo. Now, I'm not going to make the case that Veto is anywhere near the terror that was released Teo, but I do think looking at off-season implementations of the agent, teams are missing some critical theory as to why and how you can make Veto his strongest. I want to pull back the curtain on some of that theory. Hello everyone, I'm Martin Anders, Shalezy, a coach you may know from teams like Fnatic and G2, where I did a decent job of filling trophy cabinets. Heading into this competitive year, I think that Veto might be the most misunderstood agent in the lineup, which I guess, to be fair, makes sense given that he's the most recent. That said though, it would be one thing if I believed teams were attempting to use the agent the right ways and failing. What I've seen instead with Veto so far this offseason has predominantly been playing him closer to a generic, faceless Sentinel, rather than trying to capture any of the unique strategy he gives access to. You see, at really a base level, Sentinels as a class are designed around consolidating space that your team is taking control of, be that through entrenchment, information, or both. And while Veto certainly falls under that category, he does so in mostly novel ways. Even the parts of his kit that are more generically Sentinel, like his trip, have wrinkles that make them unique, such as its ability to be thrown. It's characteristics like that that I don't think are being leveraged correctly, and I think that's a great way to springboard into our first example. As a proof of concept, I've gone back over the offseason a little bit and aggregated every attacking trip usage through the Soup Valorant League as well as Red Bull Homeground. As you can see, there wasn't a whole lot of compelling variety. Almost 50% of the time it was simply plinked down in spawn as standard flank denial. A remaining third of the time it was used towards B, almost split evenly as either forward B main containment or as bend flank control. 2% of the time it was used as a slightly more interesting forward A main containment trip, something that was thrown down behind the defensive smoke once it was used just to hold that space and deny re-clears. Finally, in mid, also at 2% use, we have the one use case here of something that I believe fully leverages Veto's trip's capabilities. This trip is a full-on projectile. By using it for simple spawn-side flank coverage, we're ignoring the attribute of this ability that makes it unique. I give an honorable mention to the bend flank coverage towards B, because at least in that case, we're setting a forward battle line with our trip very quickly. We're throwing it from barriers and setting a trip that's significantly past our barrier drop as soon as buy time ends. So at baseline, I think we've really missed the boat in terms of where we're setting our passive informational trips with Veto. They shouldn't be that passive. Use the fact that this is a projectile to set forward battle lines. And even if you're not going to set those forward battle lines, there's a use case that I believe is even better. You'll have to pardon the clip quality because I've decided to go back to the Valorant Dark Ages, back to 2022, to pull up some clips of vintage Yay. You see, something that I distinctly remember during this time is that Yay and Optic, although they didn't use it a ton, did manage to popularize contact trips for scaling. I have two examples here, one from mid and one from A main, where we're scaling up and we're using our trip to hard clear space. In one situation, we're using it forward to clear our vents, and in another, we're using it to hard clear left side ramp for our A main scaling. We also have far more contemporary examples of this. Something that I think went very far under the radar was that one of the contributing factors for G2's success with their double Sentinel ascent was the use of contact trips to band-aid the comp's lack of catalytic util. Now, wouldn't it be convenient if those contact trips also happened to be a projectile that you could get deeper into sights and cover more important space? That would be awfully nice, wouldn't it? It's almost as if you could map out double Senti playbooks on other maps in the pool bringing Veto, and similar to G2's Ascent, use this trip as a piece of entry utility in order to make the comp function at a high level. It would also be mighty convenient if there was a Patreon, where you could get playbooks of exactly that. For those of you unaware, I host a Patreon where I post tier lists for every major patch covering both agents themselves as well as premier team compositions. Alongside those, I release premier-focused playbooks that provide the necessary lineups and map out all the basic protocols your team would need to run them in your games. The play I just showed was a no-notes version of a play directly out of a Chamber Veto Abyss book that released today. But that's enough of an ad for now. We haven't even covered Veto's most exciting ability, his Interceptor. Going back into that same dataset, I've mapped out all defensive interceptor uses. At a whopping 43% of the time, the overwhelming use case was an extremely passive inset interceptor on B. Following quite a ways behind it at 30% was a slightly more proactive interceptor towards danger. From there was another harsh fall off to 15% of interceptors being used as entrenchment utility on A. And I need to clarify the representation here because this isn't simply interceptors on the hard 9E to the right, it also represents interceptors on the hard 9E to the left. I simply clump them together because they are functionally achieving the same goals with minor nuance. After that, we have the small remaining trickle-ins, we have a heavily inset interceptor towards troll on B at 3%, the center site interceptor on A at 2%, and then a forward interceptor on the barrier at A at 2%. And it's that forward-most one that I want to discuss. Now you may be curious what this round looked like, and well, here it is. It comes from Fnatic's game against T1, where Alpha's playing as a solo A player, playing hyper-aggressive around his interceptor trying to set on a forward line. And while I think the intent in this play is honestly superb, I think the actual specifics of it leave so much to be desired. We can see that Alpha still gets full flash because the LOS of the interceptor doesn't get the deep lines that it needs to actually deny the utility. Alpha being on an island alone doesn't really allow him to capitalize off of that space and truly consolidate it, it just makes him fall off immediately. But you can see in concept what a proactive interceptor sort of encourages us to do. I want to break this down on an abstract level so that it can be applied across any number of maps that you want. The easiest way for me to portray this is to just yoink the exact setup out of the playbook that I just released, so we'll be doing it with Yoru, Veto, and Chamber. Step 1 is that you need to find an area with the required attributes of this setup in the first place. That's going to be a hard 90 that allows you to create a contestable corner for your interceptor to deny people's utility on, as well as fallback space for you and your team. You'll set an interceptor for that hard 90 and then have someone, ideally with untradeability, setting up on a shallow line that will contact just before the interceptor does. And then the next step, and this is something I think almost every team is missing right now, your Veto can just leave. In this setup, he has to stay here at the beginning of the round because he's setting a post-barrier interceptor, but especially in the cases of entrenchment interceptors that are placed behind our barriers, crosscuts are free pre-round. You can get across more than a third of most maps at zero opportunity cost, and yet teams are only ever really playing Vetoes on the same side as his interceptors. It makes no sense. We're not leveraging the kit correctly. Now obviously there has to be a reason for the Veto to leave, but we'll get to that soon enough. Getting back into our example, our Veto is left and we have that interceptor layered forward line. Then we have a second layer of contest towards our fallback playing anti-flash, and that will typically be someone with a flash themselves. Presuming that we've selected our space correctly and this is somewhere our opponents want to go, our opponents now have to contact into Chamber. Chamber, or our forward untradeability agent, will take that FK chance, then our refight player will launch their flash, we'll use our interceptor, that refight player will swing wide, and then the immediate tradeability and follow-up will be that initial player re-swinging. Sequencing wise, this creates a scenario where we have an untradeable first kill opportunity, a flash refight where our opponent can't match our utility that also resets a new untradeability agent onto the deep line, and there's a tradeability layer behind that, and if we've selected the space correctly, this is far before they've gotten to the site. We're creating layers of utility tax and kill opportunity far before they're doing something that actually threatens a round loss. And to see what this looks like when the rubber hits the pavement, I'm going to break down the protocols of another play out of that playbook where we use all of these exact same concepts in a refight A on Abyss. We have plenty of normal shenanigans with conditioning starts from our Astra, as well as a rotational TP preset for our Yoru, and then we have crosscuts set for our Veto that allow him to rotate off aggressively should we want it. Chamber sets up his TP on that forward line so that we can set him up for the refight. As barriers drop, Veto will set his interceptor on that hard 90, either high in the air or literally on the floor to help increase how much it breaks the crosshair for that first untradeability character. Simultaneously, elsewhere on the map, obviously Astra should be getting some sort of safe jump spot or passive deep line towards B, and Sova can condition a recon towards bottom mid. Then moving on to next steps, either based on our expectations of our opponent's pace or on our recon bottom mid, Veto can either walk his way to A-Link or teleport himself there quickly, and then we're going to have him throw a trip towards book to set a forward mid-containment line. This is what I was talking about when I was saying reasons for Veto to want to leave. And I'm sure that some people will look at this and say, well, oh, they can hear the trip. I've long been a proponent of post-barrier audio cues not being nearly the problem that people think they are. Just because your opponents know something is there doesn't mean they can deal with it safely or efficiently. Take, for example, this last year, the A-long vice wall that G2 was placing post-barriers. Even if your opponents knew it was there, they had to commit to full A-long control to actually disentrench it. If our opponent knows that this trip is mid, they still have to commit to a full-on half-mid control in order to clear it. Once that trip is in place, we can have Veto play an A-link A-heaven float, we can have Sova fall off towards B-heaven to reinforce our Astra and help create an entrenchment scenario there, and we still have that interceptor refight towards A, despite the fact that Veto is now wholly uninvolved in it. Of course, there are tons of contingency protocols layered on top of all of that, but that's too much to talk about in the video. And while I'm certainly a very long way from exhaustively explaining Veto, I do think I've done a good job at this point of illustrating what I'm talking about when I say that teams have a sort of theoretical gap in the way that they're approaching the agent. We're missing out on attributes of his utility like the fact that we can throw his trip and should be using it for deeper lines. The fact that his trophy system can be used for forward contests and not just passive entrenchment setups every single round. Veto is an incredibly unique Sentinel, especially in the way that he does probably the best job of any Senti since pre-nerf Vice of breaking out of that passive mode that Sentinels frequently find themselves stuck in to get proactive and use his tools to do something far more aggressive than would otherwise be expected. Ultimately, though, I guess we'll have to wait and see. I'll be doing watch parties of kickoffs at my Twitch in the description, and hopefully you'll be able to tag along to see if and how teams have sharpened up their Veto use. Regardless, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.